seconds. For every American out there picking up bomb debris, there'd be 5 cameramen on him. And that would be appearing all over the world. And I told him, no, I wasn't interested in that. And that's about where I left it. But I went back to the cell and I put out a message right away to these young Turks who pick it up. Get it out right now. Nobody goes out and works in town. If they get the drop and there becomes a flow and then there are advocates of and enemies against working in town, I've lost the ball game. I've got to get my message to my men from the shoulder and tell them, no, I've thought that through and that's going to backfire on us. And that's the methodology. You have to have coordination and people sensitive enough to know that the importance of speed and communication, so that when they call up people, everybody says that. That's the way it went.
You've written that in some cases, the officers who served with you really demanded leadership from you. They wanted you to tell them what was expected of them.
Well, I think that's a fair enough. I don't remember a lot of this. It got into speech, but anyway, I think that was my responsibility to give them the leadership that would steer them in the direction that we all agreed, I think, was the right course, to stick with America, to stick together, to go down to the wire together, to shoulder the load together. I've talked about, one of the things, this was a floating population, and there would be new commanders that would show up in the middle or later part of the war who were we had a problem of keeping track on seniority in there, because the war lasted so long. Pretty soon you're out flying and you're a lieutenant and your wingman is with you. You get shot down, he gets back to the ship, and then 5 years later he shows up and you're still a lieutenant and he's a commander. So we had to figure out a way to get out it, and the way we did it, I won't go through it, but when 2 men are vying for proportionate rank, the date of importance is the day the first guy gets shot down, and everything proceeds from there. If he's senior, he's still senior. Oh boy, well, this can drive you nuts, but we didn't let it worry us too much. People caught on to that, but it could get. But when the new guy does come in and leaving out, and he's a bona fide lieutenant commander, and he's the right man to be the cell block captain, and he's inexperienced and he doesn't know. He's just going through the early torture, and people say, well, let's hear what the new guy's got to say. And usually it was something like this. He said, gentlemen, I just don't understand. It's just a shock to me to come into a situation where we have so many good men being forced to do things that they would never in the world do in the land of freedom. And it's just overwhelming. The sin of that whole thing is overwhelming. And I'm going to ask you, I believe you all deserve to be the manager of your own defensive system. Now, we're starting to float. And then you might close out with a nice thing like, a well-brought-up young American with the best of intentions, say something like, and so I'll be here, and God bless you. Okay. Well, then everything's quiet in the cell block. About 5 seconds later, one of the young Turks come up. Sir, we want to sleep at night. We want our consciences clean. The least you can do is to let us say that we are adhering to the policies of our commanding officer. That's what gives us the drive and the coordinated spirit to move this thing. And when you say that we're to design our own defenses, that's the last thing we want. We want direction from the commander. We want to be known. We want to know and be sure what we take torture for. And there may be 15 or 16 or 20 items. Give us the list. We will not sit here and not complain to a commanding officer who doesn't have the courage to tell us to go to torture. I heard that all the time. That's the way the organism grew. And this guy probably says those guys were right. I had no weight. I mean, I was just trying to get out of a job. And I've got responsibility. And so this is the infighting.
You spoke earlier this evening, in fact, about in that circumstance that you developed what you called orders that can be obeyed. What do you mean by that?
One of the first things that I faced off on. So many people, it's so easy to give orders that really can't be obeyed. For instance, the guy that says, okay, here's the orders of the day. Obey the code of conduct. Well, that could be argued in a courtroom for, the guy doesn't know what to do. You've got to give specific orders that everybody can understand, and it all should be involved with the mechanism, its communication, its cohesion, its occasional top-down messages that indicate the pleasure of the top command, if you can be so. The code of conduct. I'll tell you a story that I don't think this is the first time I ever told it. No, almost. When we all got released in the spring of '73, a lot of us got invitations to military bases to give talks or to participate in reunions or whatever. And Sybil and I accepted some of those, and one of them was to the Army War College in Pennsylvania's spring, celebration, you might say. There were good speeches, there were dinner parties every night. It went on 3 or 4 days. And we were in this little area, among others, munching tidbits and having a couple of drinks, when a little guy walked up to me and he said, could I sit with you tonight? And he was a pleasant-looking little fellow. Of course, I said. You dignified? I said, yes, of course. We went over and took our seats, and he stuck out his hands and he said, hello, I'm Slam Marshall, I think I told us. And he said, how'd you get along with that code of conduct? Well, I said, how'd you get along with that name, rank, serial number thing? Well, I said, it was impossible. So we just sort of ignored it. I mean, that was beside the point. Because of the ropes, you're not going to, nobody can sit there like an Indian, and unless you just want to die and have it over with. And he said, I was afraid of that. I said, some of the guys kind of had heart pangs about that. And I'm sure in the whole of the Vietnam War, there were many people. I mean, there were dozens or scores of soldiers and officers who came face to face with the fact that this solemn pledge that they were more or less given, in survival school, there were circumstances where it wasn't even sensible not to talk. He said, well, I wrote that code of conduct, and I went back to the French and all the records. He was a newspaper man. This fellow was a fellow that was a citizen soldier in the World War I. He was probably second lieutenant out of OCS. In the World War II, he was a colonel. In the Korean War, he was a brigadier general, and Ike Eisenhower was one of his close friends, and he was a well-known person. But he said, I am bound to give only name, rank, serial number, and date of birth. And in the formal language, that means I'm obliged to only give those things. The rest of it's up to me. I've got to give name, rank, serial number, and date of birth, or I can be thrown in jail by these people or even punished in court-martial. But the rest of nobody ever, he said, it never occurred to me to have that apply to everybody. I mean, all of this was zip-lipped. Well, I said, that's what the common belief was of people that went through survival schools. And he said, well, I went to Ike. I said, why? Now, here's what triggered it. The armed forces, the armed force leaders of all the services started vying for macho position vis-a-vis the others to tell about what little their people could tell anybody. You know, no, in the Army, we're not even, if you're on a diet, you have to have pills, you're not allowed to tell them. If you're in the Coast, I mean, everybody was one up. And he said, call these service chiefs in and read them the riot act, Ike, because this is going to ruin the whole damn thing. He said he never got around to that. But
you did with orders that can be obeyed.
Huh?
You did with orders that can be obeyed.
Yeah.
You brought that back down.
Well, that's a true story. I don't know whether to try to do something with that. Several things that might be a lesson learned for the next war. Because it's plenty to ask a person to tell him, you know, just going in there. The idea that silence is a blessing to a fighter is baloney. You've got to have guile. You've got to be able to tell stories. You've got to be able to tell lies. One time my interrogator, Rabbit, said, and I didn't, you know, I wasn't looking for writing to do, but he said, I got to get you to write something. So I said, why don't you let me write history? Let me give you a history of the American-Korean War. Okay, he couldn't believe it. So here's what I wrote, and it took, you know, several hours. I said, when the Americans first got into the Korean War, they didn't understand the thing. Here was the United Nations, and they were there in some pose that nobody really understood. And they were disorganized. Now, I'm exaggerating. I was probably telling things that really aren't true. I wasn't trying to tell them the truth. I wanted to tell them what I wanted to tell them. But anyway, but the only thing, the Americans were disturbed because the others were leading their men in battle. And then the only thing that really changed the situation is when they started talking about brainwashing. Now, I don't believe there is such a thing as brainwashing, but I didn't put that in the story. But I said and I said, the population rose as one man when they heard that the communist armies were trying to brainwash their sons. And that was the downfall. It was then that we generated power and took over. This is the short version. Well, he took it away, and he didn't, you know, he was a pretty savvy, sophisticated guy, and he thought the whole idea was, you know, he wasn't going to argue with me about that. But I heard the commissar, who'd learned to speak English, outside my window one day, telling a bunch of American visitors, he said, you know, ladies and gentlemen, we have a very strict rule here in Vietnam. We will not brainwash. We will discuss, and we will point out problems with your point of view, but we have never taken up brainwashing. I want you to tell all the people back home. Okay.
Admiral, you once wrote, in your words, you said, the Stoics said character is fate. In my life, education has been fate. And you've also told the story